Welcome to the Health Feeds Performance podcast, where we believe that whole body nourishment is a requisite for athletic success. I'm your host, Ian Craig from the Centre for Integrative Sports Nutrition, and today I'm with Joe Lillis from the Cambridge Centre for Sport and Exercise Sciences at Anglia Ruskin University. Our topic today is cardiovascular nourishment from plant-based polyphenols in a sport and exercise context. So cardiovascular health, it's a fundamental thing for athletes. And what I find is the assumption is that the more we train, the more cardiovascularly conditioned we are, but fitness doesn't always necessitate health. So what we need to be aware of is how do we actually nourish cardiovascular health? Because some of the research I've done points to exercisers or athletes overdoing it, which can actually cause cardiovascular harm in the long run. And I did a webinar on this a couple of years ago. So today we're going to go into obviously the nutritional aspects of supporting cardiovascular health. And Joe is well positioned to do that based on his research. So yeah, let's dive in, Joe. Let's get into a nutrition discussion. But before we do that, please can you tell people what you do, who you are, and the cool research you're doing, and also your sport?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone. So Ian, thank you very much for having me. As Ian said, my name's Joe Lillis. I'm a postgraduate researcher, so I'm a PhD candidate at the Cambridge Centre for Sport and Exercise Sciences based in Cambridge. My research is based all around polyphenols and one particular olive-derived polyphenol and its possible impact on inflammatory mediators and functional movement. So I'm sure we'll get onto that a little bit later. As Ian said, I've been doing this for a little while, worked in the nutrition space for a few years now, and outside of that, I play Australian rules football, that's hence this slightly iffy photo used on the website of some hair wavering in the background. That was from a recent trip to Toronto in the Transatlantic Cup for Great Britain. So a little bit about me.
Cool, thanks, Joe. All right, so you got the scientist hat, and you've also got the athlete's hat, and I find that's a really, really helpful transition that you can have. Theory is only good when you can put it into practice. So some of the people who are going to be listening and watching will know what polyphenols are, but some won't. So can you give us a bit of an explanation what they are, where you find them, and what your particular interest is in them?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so very simply, polyphenols are compounds that are found in plants, that's fruit, vegetables, and flowers. I think before we go on, it's quite important to just touch on one topic that's differentiates them from a few other compounds that are out there, that they often get grouped in the same manner in conversation. So first and foremost, vitamins and minerals are well defined within literature, and there's a number of plant-derived compounds that don't fall under the micronutrient and the vitamin mineral classification. And the reason for that is because they don't contribute to basic biochemical processes like growth and healthy development. Now, what that means is inadequacies within polyphenols and their intake, it's not associated to any diseases or specific diseases in the same manner that things like an iron deficiency might be. Now, that being said, there's a growing body of evidence that denotes when polyphenols are consumed regularly or consistently, they may well play a really important role in the fine-tuning of the human body, but on a cellular level. Now, that impact on a cellular level is there's possibilities, and that's what we think. It may well positively impact long-term health, and in some cases, which is why we're all here probably, is exercise performance. So just to clear that up, first and foremost, I think that's important. So maybe a more scientific definition of polyphenols. They're recognized and they're known as secondary plant metabolites. Now, and that's secondary plant metabolites of vascular plants. Now, polyphenols are produced by plants themselves in a response to a specific stressor, so things like pathogens or ultraviolet light. Now, that part is really important, the link to a stressor, because it, in a very simple way, almost mimics the response that we experience or that is elicited in humans. And that being said, when a dose is appropriate or consistent, the primary way that this takes place is through a polyphenol acts as an antioxidant. People will hopefully be familiar with that, and we'll class them in that they fall into that bracket, into that family. Polyphenols are more often than not broken down into families themselves. Primarily non-flavonoids and flavonoids are the two that you may see sort of well rehearsed in literature. But on occasion, they're broken down further than that into flavonoids, stilbenes, lignans, and phenolic acids. Now, I mentioned plants already, and I think obviously the kind of the geeky nerdy side comes out when you see some of the really cool effects and the cool things that these polyphenols can actually do. And there are some really wicked examples of that in nature that I think really, if you were to go back, sort of prompted researchers to look at it in a human setting. And one of those for me that I read about early on with this is due to their protective component. There's been examples before of the polyphenols produced by plants and produced by specific strains of plants actually totally eradicating wood rot in a specific area in woodland in a forest. And that's one sort of example of what they can do. And like I said, it's kind of important. We'll link that back to a human perspective. And what it looks like from that human perspective is an efficient protection against oxidative stress and certain pathologies that are associated with oxidative stress. So things like cancer, diabetes and neurodegeneration, things like Alzheimer's. And that's all kind of to do with their ability to combat and fight free radicals that are associated with oxidative stress. I'll leave that. I guess that's there for now. We'll touch on the exercise a little bit more.
So that was a very good explanation. Thank you. And the bit about plants needing to be stressed is quite a big one, and I think it brings up the topic of organic versus non-organic and wild as well. So can you just say a wee bit more about that, about how plants need to defend themselves and how they're cultivated will then influence their polyphenol content? Yeah, so there's
many aspects that can influence the total polyphenol content, like you mentioned. But I guess right back to the beginning, especially in certain plants and in certain fruits where you see crops grown in harsher conditions, warmer conditions, there's competition for water, nutrients, sunlight. That's where that protective component is generated. And it's ultimately the fruits that have been sort of accustomed to that kind of environment that are often more potent or carry higher polyphenol content. Now, when it comes to the actual farming and sort of consumption of the fruits themselves, I'm obviously using the fruit-derived polyphenol background initially. But so certain crops, if they're grown prior to if they're cut down or used prior to being fully ripe, so their ripeness levels can really fluctuate and alter the polyphenol content. The way they're stored when they're carried from crop to farmhouse, from farmhouse to fridge or freezer, and in this day and age, more than likely transatlantic, the way they're stored in that process. And then again, they're how they get from the supermarket shelf to your cupboards at home can all play significant impact into the actual polyphenol content of a fruit. And that's a really key thing to think about. Again, from an athlete perspective, 100 grams of strawberries at the beginning of the season may have wildly different polyphenol content to 100 grams of strawberries at the end of the strawberry picking season. And that's some of the fun and games that the coaches and practitioners have to deal with when sort of supplementing in the diet.
And something that comes to my mind as well is 100 grams of strawberries from a commercial farm somewhere across the country versus a local farm where you can come and pick your own. Does the sweetness and the taste link to the polyphenol content? Has that been looked at?
Yeah, and it's often the kind of the bitterness or the sharpness, the kind of the tang that comes with the fruit, and not only is synonymous with citrus fruits, but other juicy fruits, I guess, is the way to use it. And it's that the flavor and that component you just described quite nicely is something that is almost like a really easy way of identifying the quality of the product.
Yeah, taste tells you a lot.
It certainly does. And taste and price, unfortunately, sometimes now especially.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good start to polyphenols. Can we go into cardiovascular health a wee bit, because that's obviously the backdrop of the podcast. So as an exercise physiology student, we're all students of the human body, studying the human body. How does the cardiovascular health work in an athletic context? How do we nourish that cardiovascular health and fitness so that an athlete performs better?
Yeah, so I think it's quite important, isn't it? I think we use the term cardiovascular quite regularly. People understand what CV means from all walks of life. So I would argue from a sport and exercise setting, and I think it's important to include the exercise too. I tend to think of it as kind of tuning the engine. CV health and cardiovascular health, in my mind, just talks about tuning the engine that is your heart, your circulatory system, and your respiratory system. And the reason we have to do that is because similar to a car and an engine in a car, we need to be able to distribute blood, the nutrient-rich blood, the oxygen-rich blood, as efficiently around the body as possible in a day-to-day life, but also in an exercise bout. Now we know that increasing exercise volume and exercise intensity. Now, I'm not going to prescribe daily amounts or hours required, but we know literature demonstrates to us that increasing exercise volume results in higher oxygen levels through the increased oxygen into your body, more blood flow to your muscles, and then wider capillaries, in simple terms, to deliver more oxygen to your muscles and carry away the waste products. Now, off the back of that, for me, it's quite clear we can see vasodilation, O2 delivery, O2 capacity, and arguably the recovery of those components are really important factors to be considered around cardiovascular health and around exercise performance in general. So if there are things out there, that can support them or could be useful, that could be something that's quite important. Something that I've not mentioned just yet around cardiovascular health and cardiovascular exercise and the impact that it can have on mitochondrial dynamics. So things like mitochondrial biogenesis, mitochondrial fusion, fission, and ultimately autophagy. Perhaps most importantly, amongst all of those, is the mitochondrial adaptations due to the link to ATP generation, which, from an exercise perspective, is paramount. So with cardiovascular exercise and sort of CV exercise in general, there are many methods. Again, from a student or physiologist perspective, there's many strategies or methods used to measure this, because it is arguably one of the precursors for athletic performance. It's one of the predictors, rather, of athletic performance. The big one I'm sure people are familiar with, for me, that we see all the time is VO2 max. Now, people talk about VO2 max and VO2 testing. For the majority of amateur athletes all the way up to elite athletes, talking about VO2 max almost becomes, it's like a bragging right to say, my VO2 max is this number, Mike, what's yours, what's this, etc. Now, if people have the luxury of laboratories or can go to institutions whereby sports scientists can initiate this test and put this test into practice once or twice a year, it's an excellent strategy to plot and measure, and it's an indicator of aerobic capacity, or it's the predictor of aerobic capacity. Now, there are many other tests and sort of ways that require less important equipment, less expensive equipment. So things like FTP tests or step tests, or even to some extent critical power tests, can also provide an indicator to aerobic capacities and therefore cardiovascular fitness, cardiovascular health. So from a practitioner's perspective, they can be really useful to kind of signpost and improve upon. But interestingly for me, something that we've come about and we've published on a couple of years back is the idea of economy. And that's something that is, I feel, quite often overlooked in literature as an important component of cardiovascular health, fitness, etc. Now, what economy does, and particularly O2 economy, is it focuses on the athlete's ability to utilize the fuel they have available to them. So it's measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. But like I've said, it directs or it identifies, like I said, the athlete's ability to utilize the fuel available. So in other words, the VO2 max, you could have lungs like bin bags, but ultimately if you can't use the fuel or the O2 in this case that you're breathing back efficiently, kind of what use is there? So I think that's quite an important. I think that we'll start seeing that more and more in literature, referred to in literature as the economy perspective.
That's funny. My undergrad study in 1994 was looking at VO2 max, economy, and lactates. And you'd find some people had very high VO2 max, but it didn't necessarily correlate well to performance. But running economy didn't have a brilliant correlation either. But when you combine the two, there's a measure called velocity at VO2 max. And that gave a very good prediction of performance. So what's your aerobic power combined with how efficiently can you use it? Okay, so thanks for the kind of overview of the cardiovascular health. Can you then link the two? So we obviously need good antioxidant systems and antioxidants coming through the diet for cardiovascular health. So how do the polyphenols help that? What are we doing to support the cardiovascular system when we talk about antioxidants?
So I think straight away the strength of polyphenols in this situation, my head goes to two things that ironically kind of tick the box of one of a performance measure and one of a kind of a recovery measure. So first and foremost, I think I mentioned we touched on the mitochondria, and particularly mitochondrial biogenesis. So, and just so everybody's aware that's the cell. That's where a cell increases the number of mitochondria they have through growth or division of the existing mitochondria. So it's really, really important due to the links to ATP generation from an exercise perspective. There's many proteins that are proteins and transcription factors that are involved in the process, and individually they've been shown to be influenced by polyphenol supplementation. So a couple of good examples of that are resveratrol. So the naturally occurring polyphenol it can promote mitochondrial biogenesis in various tissues, one of them actually inclusive of nervous tissue. Another example is hydroxytyrosol. It's found in olives. Again, a polyphenolic compound that can stimulate the activity of PGC1 alpha, which again directly linked, that's one of the proteins I mentioned, which directly linked to the upregulation or the enhancement of mitochondrial biogenesis. So from an exercise perspective, an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis supports and kind of helps the body use the oxygen to generate energy, which then has a direct influence or may have a direct influence on improving athletic performance. And is also, interestingly, perhaps in some instances, in some literature, also influence the delay of fatigue. So when you're looking at the top end of performance, that can be something that's quite interesting. That works off the notion that in order to sustain a workload, the skeletal muscle requires sufficient production and distribution of energy during the actual exercise itself. And the mitochondria forms huge networks within muscle cells to support that function. Does that answer your question? I think so. Sort of part of it anyway. What did I say? There was two parts, wasn't there?
Yeah, so you gave us a good understanding of mitochondria and production of energy, and obviously that's really important for fitness. Are mitochondria important for health as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they're linked to, in the same way that I mentioned prior, the impact that polyphenols can have on metabolic diseases and metabolic pathologies. There can be very similar or effects can be elicited in that notion. And interestingly, I guess the same with all research, there's a significant amount and recently a significant more amount of literature and research looking into polyphenols' possible impact and potential impact on these metabolic pathologies. That's where the interest peaked initially. It's kind of from those working models and from those working methods that we've extracted from the sports science community, have extracted those ideas, those thoughts, and the links between the mechanistic components as to where we're seeing some of the benefits from a sporting perspective.
Cool. All right. So polyphenols, antioxidants, they sound really good within a health and a exercise context. Before we go further, can you give a few examples? So we've got some good science there, but what are the plants we're talking about? You mentioned olives. What else?
So I mean, there's a few from a sort of a fruit derived perspective. A few key ones come to mind that the literature is all kind of the foundation of the literature is focused on. So one of the key ones for me that piqued my interest in this is cherries, tart cherry juice, Montmorency cherry. We see benefits in that in both acute and chronic doses. One of the sort of the key papers to come out from this, looking at tart cherry juice, there were marathon runners were supplementing 235 milliliters of tart cherry juice 5 days prior to a marathon performance, and for 2 days, 5 days prior, and 2 days after the marathon performance. And this reduced inflammatory markers. We saw increases in antioxidant capacity and improved recovery of isometric strength in strength tests in the days following. So that was conducted by a research group, so Glyn Howardson's research group up in Northumbria. Again, I don't want to discredit anybody else, but as far as I'm aware, and for the purpose of this conversation, the research from a polyphenol perspective from those guys kind of spearheaded things over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. There's one example from a chronic perspective. Test my memory. From an acute perspective, we see similar benefits to cherry juices or Montmorency cherry as a concentrate. And it values from sort of 50 to 70 milliliters of Montmorency cherry concentrate an hour and a half prior to exercise has been shown to improve peak power and overall increase the total work performed or the total work capacity in exercise. And that example is in sprint performance, but there's many other examples out there. I appreciate that's one, and we focus on cherries there. There are many others, so I can give you a couple others now.
So Just give us a list of a few foods that have been shown to be high in polyphenols, and then we can go into the research.
Go into it. Quercetin, resveratrol, pomegranate extract, from food first sort of perspectives, blueberries, chokeberries, green tea extract is a great one for catechins, and like I mentioned, the cherries, and I will include olives in that realm just to plug my own work there.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple that have had a lot of research. One's quercetin. It's probably a name a lot of people know about. David Neiman in North Carolina, he's an exercise immunologist who's been around for a long, long time. And he had a spate of doing research on quercetin and mitochondrial function. But that was just supplementation. So I started researching, okay, what foods are high in it? Apples and onions come up, but then olives as well, red wine too. So it just seems to be a compound in a lot of different, let's say dense, nutritional density type foods. Resveratrol you mentioned as well. So first thing we think of maybe is red wine. Anne asked in the chat box earlier, are there other ways to get in resveratrol apart from having a glass of red wine before you go out doing your exercise?
That's another good question. I think what's really important to touch on there very briefly, as you mentioned, is that not one food product has only one polyphenol. So it's not as simple. In that sense, it is similar. Can be considered similar to micronutrients, in that if you were to, if you have some spinach in your salad and your dinner, you're ticking the box of iron, but you're also going to be ticking the box of various other micronutrients, different vitamins, vitamin C, etc., that's in smaller quantities. So there are these kind of banner foods and banner like resveratrol, red wine, but actually you'll find resveratrol in simply grapes alone on their own. But you will need to consume a much greater quantity of the grape than you would from the concentrated red wine, if that makes sense. So there are, and that's something that's really important. And again, it's, I guess, whilst we're on the subject, is we see there's no upper limit per se for polyphenols. Now, one of the reasons for that undoubtedly is there's currently over 8,000 of them recognized in the wild, in our foods, etc. Now, there's no recommended daily intake like there is for micronutrients and macronutrients. So from a practitioner or a coach's perspective, or a self-sufficient athlete, it becomes really challenging to understand. Okay, so I'm 100 kilos. What do I need in comparison to my 50 kilo training partner? Or do the values increase? Do they decrease? How much do we need of a certain compound compared to another? There are what's called no adverse effect limits or no adverse effect levels that are published for some of the big, more popular, the big hitters, the more popular polyphenols. But quite frankly, a lot of those adverse levels or no adverse effect levels have been discovered through animal models and animal studies, and the quantities are astronomical for a lot of these. So getting the right amount of the polyphenols in you is something, the dose and the supplementation strategy is something that is really challenging to get right. Now, in literature, there's been, so Botel and Kelly, two prolific names in this kind of area. One of their reviews, they stipulate 300 milligrams in the hours surrounding exercise, 300 milligrams of polyphenols in the hours surrounding exercise is an appropriate dose to elicit effects, and they've backed that up with the research. For an acute setting, but for a more chronic setting, they recommend 1,000 milligrams daily, consistently, in order to elicit similar effects to performance and training. Now, that's great to have a baseline. To play devil's advocate, what does that actually mean from how do we implement that to athletes from different genders, different heights, different weights, over the board, different sports? Undoubtedly, their needs are going to be subtly different, and that's one of the questions that, again, the first question I asked in my research was how much and what do you need of that. So I know I went off a bit of tangent there, but I thought that was important to mention.
Yeah, it's very important. If an athlete's maybe got a nutritionist support, maybe they can access that information, roughly you're going to get this many milligrams by taking X, Y, Z. If it's somebody who's just trying to keep fit and healthy, what would be a rough rule of thumb? They don't want to get into the quantities. What does their diet need to look like?
I guess, so that's another great point. So I guess similar to other components from diet and from the training perspective, what's the goal? I guess would be the key, the first question I would ask. If we're looking for, if we're going for a parkrun 5K PB, then great, we can ensure diet is appropriate surrounding work and kids and family, and maybe look to implement a food first source just before the race. So a good example of that we've seen is up to 300 grams of blueberries prior to a fatigue-inducing exercise protocol can elicit some antioxidant effects and suppress things like, in some cases, suppress inflammation, and we'll see some beneficial effects. If the goal is slightly more, it is slightly different to that. It requires more training, more sort of commitment to it, perhaps a half marathon or a 100K bike ride. Again, I would focus on a food first strategy. It's a similar food isn't, and I'm sure nutritionists will be wincing at me saying this, but I don't think, from my perspective, the idea of food and the strategy around food and the way we implement food as humans, it doesn't need to be that complex. If we commit to it, hitting protein targets and eating the rainbow, we can tick most boxes off from a diet perspective. And I think if I don't know, if not your average Joe, but if you're looking you want to tweak one or two things in your diet, I think I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the key things that polyphenols can attribute to in plant sources is their color. And if we're looking at bright, fresh fruit, veg, you can be 50% sure that at least you're going to be securing some good quality polyphenols in there. If you're a recreational athlete, I think that's the key for me, is to make sure your plates are colourful, and that you'll be consuming appropriate amounts. There may be subtle differences, and I might tweak that slightly if we're looking at combat sports or contact sports, where the body maybe perhaps goes through a slightly different version of stress response, a different or slightly heightened inflammatory response perhaps to that of a runner or a cyclist or a hockey player. And there'll be intricacies all over the place, but that would be my general advice. Food first approach as a recreational athlete. And if you're really looking to increase your polyphenol content, there's lots of the supplements themselves are food sourced. So I think that's the best place to start.
So the supplements you're talking about, like you mentioned tart cherry juice, you can get that in a concentrate, you can get blackcurrant, blackberry, pomegranate. So these are all really good sources. Can you overdose it? And the context of my question is what I call the antioxidant debate, because researchers have been arguing almost 20 years now that yes, we should supplement antioxidants around exercise. Oh no, we shouldn't, because antioxidants are an important signaling mechanism for recovery. Is it the same with polyphenols? Can we overdose on them?
Yeah, it is. Overdose is maybe, I don't know if that's the correct terminology. The antioxidant debate is really important. I think the first thing you need to understand for the antioxidant debate is the idea of exogenous versus endogenous. So let me get this right around. endogenous antioxidants, and we have antioxidants in our body regardless, right? They are, if you want to consume any antioxidants, your body has the appropriate amount to support health, wellness, fight diseases in the same way that I mentioned at the beginning as that the plants do. They can support you as an entity and make sure your primary functions are maintain and support you to maintain homeostasis. Now, oxidative stress, which is what we see from exercise or from metabolic pathologies, like I mentioned, or simple distress and lack of sleep can also result in the same thing. It's something that's one of the key components here. Now, from an exercise perspective, we see oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is present when the endogenous antioxidants are outweighed by the reactive oxygen species in the body. So from the strain and the challenge of exercise, the reactive oxygen species, or ROS for the purpose of this, sort of win that battle against the endogenous antioxidants. And that's when things like the supplementation, the exogenous components can come into play, and that's when it can be really valuable. And the reason we train, right, the reason people conduct exercise from a recreational perspective all the way to the top end of athletes fighting for Olympic medals is to get better. In order to get better, we need that stress response. And in order for that stress response, that's where we see adaptation. In the same way, again, like we mentioned before with the plants, the lack of nutrients, the harsh weather, etc., they have to toughen up, for want of a better word, in order to be successful. And that's why we train. In a muscular level, sarcomere damage, tissue damage, protein comes in, allows for strength development, etc., in very simple rudimentary terms. Now, like I mentioned, through exercise, we see whether it's isometric exercise or anaerobic or aerobic, there are various components that come into that ultimately will lead to this reactive oxygen species. So things like, again, terms people may have heard of, like lipid peroxidation, protein oxidation, immunosuppression. These types of things are precede or follow the actual exercise itself. Now, if you imagine, I imagine it, and I'm sure when we spoke about this before, Ian, to sort of at length, we see there's a really great figure, and he pictures it almost as a seesaw. Is it Ho? Is it Ho et al? I think it is. Can't remember the date. And they almost show it as a seesaw where there's. Pardon?
He et al.
He et al. Okay, I was one letter off. It's a really great figure. It worked really well for me because it allowed me to actually visualize. If you imagine it like a seesaw, so this adaptive response to exercise versus oxidative stress, and it's the antioxidants almost, again, without sounding too biased to pro antioxidants, they kind of level out that seesaw. And what that does is it reduces the muscular fatigue, increases or supports the muscle adaptation following exercise. It supports substrate utilization from a recovery perspective. So keeping that kind of equilibrium, keeping that redox status level is really important. And I think that's quite a long-winded way of getting to the point about the antioxidant debate. It's very similar to the kind of inflammation debate that some people will say by additionally or unnecessarily supplementing with exogenous antioxidants, we're eradicating the need, or we're sort of oversaturating the body, and therefore, A, there's no need for it, and B, some of the antioxidant will then become pro-oxidative, and therefore become damaging. Now, the other side of the coin there is the antioxidants actually do exactly what they say on the tin. They become really valuable, and they support that redox status and support that adaptive response. I think that's probably covered that. I think. I'm not sure I've missed anything out there.
Good answer. Yeah, really, really good. So I think that's a really key one, and you've given a good balanced answer. There's so many scientists that will be on one side or another of that. But kind of in other words, almost to paraphrase, I think what you were saying, the more stress and strain that you're going to put on your body, the more needs for exogenous or nutrition-based antioxidants to come into your body.
I mean, some level of soreness and inflammation is normal after a workout or after a training session, and that's the body's natural healing process. The point that I think that I'm getting at, or at least again without giving it away, the side I would err on is when the exercise intensity increases, when the duration increases. If you're not there, if you haven't adapted to that exercise modality, the oxidative stress may well take over, and at what point it limits your ability to return to baseline. I think that's the thing, that no one's ever going to train fresh, especially sort of top end professional athletes. The idea of training fresh is a luxury, and being able to compete a race at 100% ability is rare. But the idea of returning to a baseline level where you can appropriately train again to initiate further adaptation to exercise, further muscular adaptation or neuromuscular adaptation is something that's really important. And that's where the exogenous antioxidants can come into play to support that process and sort of enable you to return to baseline so you can continue to train or to perform.
Cool, thank you. And is it the same with vitamin and mineral-based antioxidants? So like vitamin C, vitamin E, CoQ10 are a grouping of antioxidants.
Yeah, so it's a really good point, because there's a lot of debate, again, well, perhaps not less debate, but a lot of conversation and literature around this whole inorganic versus organic. And I'm aware that we've spent a lot of today speaking about organic compositions, organic polyphenols. So I'll come on to Q10 in a second. But vitamin E and vitamin C are two excellent examples of antioxidants, and to not completely go back on what I've said previously, they can be considered antioxidants as well as obviously micronutrients. Now, in fact, when we see a diet when we see people or athletes consuming a diet rich in these micronutrients, that may well be the most sensible or elicit the most beneficial effect to exercise. What the literature shows us is, specifically for vitamin E, when supplemented alone or when supplemented surrounding exercise for a chronic period, we start to see blocking of anabolic signaling pathways. So that can obviously have an impact on and impair adaptations to exercise. Now, a lot of the examples are in resistance exercise training. There's not as much on aerobic exercise, but drawing clear conclusions on aerobic exercise can be more challenging due to the variations in fitness levels and supplementation protocols. I guess to summarize that point, there's little to no consistent evidence or supporting a positive effect of vitamin E supplementation on health and athletic performance for most athletes. There are one or two sort of exceptions to that rule, and that's that athletes training or competing at altitude. We see some positive effects from a vitamin E, sort of isolated vitamin E supplementation, or again, in some cases, there's been positive outputs or results that support exercise performance for extremely acute and very short-term high-dose supplementation of vitamin E, looking for immediate results. We're talking like pre-race, pre-800 meters, pre-2K, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of not up in the air, but the key thing to remember about those two nutrients in particular is because they are recognized micronutrients, they have upper levels. So it can be really, you need to, from a practitioner perspective, I know taking too much vitamin C, probably not going to do too much unless you're doing it for an awfully long time, but it's just something to be wary of. CoQ10 is, so coenzyme Q10 is known as it's a ubiquinone, so it's naturally occurring. It's a biochemical cofactor and an antioxidant that's produced in the human body. So we're similar to, like I mentioned, the endogenous. That's one of those. Now it can be supplemented, and it can be obtained from other dietary sources, so things like meat, fish, certain seed oils, certain vegetables, and it plays a really important role in the electron transport chain. So that has significant links to ATP and therefore mitochondria. So similar to other polyphenols, CoQ10 may well support mitochondrial biogenesis on a cellular level, and that link to ATP and therefore muscle function is really important. And there's that link to energy that can be that arguably sort of maybe in my mind would put it superior to things like vitamin C and vitamin E complexes. Now there's a lot of literature around CoQ10 and heart function from non-exercising individuals. For example, I'm sure that there's one of the reviews I picked up recently, over 1,200 participants included, a variation of sort of beneficial or positive effects from heart function. And the important thing for that one is there's no adverse events or no adverse effects were recorded, but it's linked to the heart again because the heart's always working, heart's always pumping, heart's always it's the focus. And again, it sort of circles back to what we spoke about at the beginning. From an energy perspective, it can be a really, really useful, beneficial nutrient for anybody. That I know I've mentioned non-exercising, but also for the exercising, recreational, all the way up to superior athletes.
Cool, thank you. Right, let's get on to your research. You've laid the platform. You've talked a lot about polyphenols. We know what they are. Nobody's been looking at olives though. So I've got this little leaflet from a beautiful biodynamic farm called Fattoria La Viala, which I'll probably pronounce really badly. And your picture is in next to Justin in one of the pages because you're doing research on the polyphenol contents of an olive extract that they do called polyphenolia. Tell us more about polyphenolia and what you found out.
Okay, so yeah, Fattoria La Viala, incredible place. Very fortunate to be collaborating with them. They're co-funding my doctoral research currently. As you mentioned, they're actually Europe's largest organic and biodynamic farm, which is an incredible status to have. Their products are phenomenal. I know I'm sounding like I'm biased, but as you rightfully will know, you've been there too, I believe. It's an awesome place to go. A few years ago, in the middle of COVID, I was twiddling my thumbs with no flights leaving the UK. Justin Roberts spoke to me. I believe he's been on a guest here too. We both know him well. He's my primary supervisor. He came to me. He spoke to me about the farm. We had a look at a few things. Very interested, both obviously together, both interested in polyphenols. And they have this one product. It's called polyphenolia. Now nobody knows anything about it. There is, I can tell you from absolute certainty. I've just conducted a review on the topic. There is, I can count on one hand the amount of human studies that look at not only the nutrients in polyphenolia, but olive-derived polyphenols and exercise. So there's next to nothing out there. Justin pulled together a team. We conducted some sort of, I don't like using the term exploratory research, but ultimately it was exploratory research, looking at polyphenolia, its possible impact on exercise performance. That was as loose as the title was at the time. Now, polyphenolia itself is an ingredient. It's potent in specific olive-derived polyphenols. It's a product. It's served in it looks like tiny jam jars, 25, 28 milliliter jam jars. It's a very dark liquid. It doesn't taste amazing, as you would imagine. An olive fruit water doesn't taste incredible. It's produced during the olive making process. So very simply, when the olives are pressed for olive oil, the oil shoots out of one spout, and this wastewater, the pulp, the stones, everything else is usually discarded. Fattoria La Viala, they keep it. They understand the process. They understand the potency of the polyphenols that may well be in this olive fruit water. They understand through many studies looking into the Mediterranean diet and the effects of blue zone diet, etc., the possible benefits that could be in this waste product, and that's what it was previously. It's a waste product. It's too toxic to throw into the ground. People were using it for different crops, but it can't be used. They did a few different tests on it, concentrated down. It's now sold and marketed as a health promoting product. It's just lots of different polyphenols, very potent polyphenol mix. We looked at it, like I mentioned, fast forward in an exercise setting, and what we demonstrated was polyphenolia. It demonstrated a modest antioxidant effect. So that was based off of a reduction in superoxide dismutase activity. So that's a marker of oxidative stress. Immediately following exercise and also the day after exercise. And there was an increase in glutathione immediately post-exercise too, compared to the placebo. Now, we also saw various benefits in running economy, like I mentioned, again, not to plug my own research. We saw benefits in running economy and various other sort of physiological statistics. So off the back of that, I spent a couple of years conducting further research, working, etc. I was hooked on this product. I have an invested interest from a personal perspective in inflammatory-based diseases. And based off of the results we saw from the antioxidant properties and the possible ability to combat oxidative stress, I made the link with inflammation. We approached Vittoria again. We approached Laviala again, and they agreed to conduct some more research with us. I was very fortunate to be in the position I'm in now, completing a funded PhD. Now the title of my PhD is the impacts of polyphenolia, or hydroxytyrosol-rich phytocomplex, which is polyphenolia, on inflammatory mediators and functional movement in a UK-based adult population. So hydroxytyrosol is that's the primary polyphenol that's in the polyphenolia complex. So previously I mentioned earlier on in the podcast about the kind of, each food may be comprised of 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 various polyphenols, and we hear about resveratrol and red wine as the banner. The banner polyphenol for olives is hydroxytyrosol. So we're hedging our bets on the hydroxytyrosol and the combination of the interaction of the other polyphenols may have an impact on inflammation and inflammatory mediators following exercise.
And have you found some positive benefits there?
So yeah, I've just gone into year 2. So first and foremost for me, the question was, as with any of this that we mentioned, I alluded to previously, is to how much of this stuff do we actually need? What does the dosing look like? How much do I need to give people to elicit an effect? So my PhD is designed. There's 4 sort of experimental studies in addition to a review. The primary experimental study that I've conducted is an assessment of bioavailability. So I've already completed it, but my aim was to identify which dose relative to a body mass is most appropriate for supplementation. So the way we did that was through the bioavailability assessment, trying to identify which dose allowed for the most amount of hydroxytyrosol to get into the system and get into circulation to then possibly elicit an effect. We're running we have results on that. I can't share them just yet. We know we have a good idea to the dose that's required, and now from this moment on, it's all about exercise. So I'll be putting people through some nasty exercise protocols to elicit exercise-induced inflammation. We'll be looking at acute versus a chronic dose, and then later on over the next 2 years, we're looking at what a longitudinal dose can do. Now I'm interested in the exercise. Yes, my sort of primary variable in all of this is functional ability. So it links to that idea that I spoke about previously of bringing people back to baseline. So at what point can people become more functional in their movement, get back to training a little bit quicker? And I guess to expand on that from the rest of the non-exercising population, is there anything that we can do or anything that we can implement that may actually be able to reduce certain sort of certain symptoms and increase their ability to exercise? Can we get people who have systemic inflammation or low-grade inflammation or don't have the capacity to exercise that currently? Can we reduce those markers and then get them moving, get them active? Because I think that's immensely valuable across the board.
Thanks, Joe. I think that's really powerful. Were you talking about one type of extract that can go from potentially elite athletes right down to chronic disease states? So that's the power, what I like to call nature's pharmacy.
Absolutely, yeah. I like that. I love that statement. So we'll have to wrap it up for now, but I'd be really keen to have you back when you're at a further point in your studies, and we could just talk about olives for an hour. I think that'd be quite cool. I'd love that. Yeah, that sounds great.
So Joe, just to finish up, if somebody wants to connect with you or find you, where do they need to go?
I think I am Joe Lillis or Joseph Lillis on all sort of platforms. I guess the professional answer would be go to my LinkedIn. I do my best to keep up with that. If you want to see anything outside of work, yeah, the Instagram is there. But perhaps for work related content, yeah, LinkedIn is the place to go. Yeah,
if you want to see lots of Aussie rules football photos, go to Instagram. Yeah,
that's the place to go. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Joe. It's been really, really interesting.
Appreciate the time. Thanks a lot for having me on, Ian. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I really appreciate the generous input of Joe and all my other guests on the Health Feeds Performance podcast. To watch more of or listen to more of my interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or join one of the other main podcast channels. I'm also really keen to find out what you would like to see in future. So go onto our website, intsportsnutrition.com, and leave us a message through the contact page. And while you're on there, have a little look at all the courses that we run. So until next time, bye for now.